Good morning and welcome to the Washington Institute for the Near East Policy. I'm Neomi Neumann and I'm a visiting fellow at the Washington Institute. I'm happy to convene today's session, which deals with the end of the first phase of the ceasefire in Gaza Strip and the expected development moving forward. As you know, the first phase of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, which began in January 2025, ended after 42 days. During this period, there was a pause in the fighting between the sides, which included gradual withdrawal from a certain area in the Gaza Strip and the entry of humanitarian aid. The high point was the release of 38 hostages by Hamas, 30 of whom were alive, and 8, unfortunately, were deceased. Israel released approximately 2,000 Palestinian prisoners, some of whom were serving life sentence for the murder of many Israelis over the years, sparking difficult debate within the Israeli society. However, during this ceasefire period, other significant events took place. Hamas took advantage of the ceasefire, strengthened its civilian and military grip on the ground, and furthermore, managed to deepen public awareness among Gazan population that Hamas is here to stay. In the West Bank, in light of the increasing terrorist threat, Israel is dealing with pockets of resistance in the refugee camp, employing measures that have not been used since the Second Intifada. In the same time, Hamas enjoy relatively broad support in the West Bank public. US President Donald Trump introduced into the discourse the vision of the Gaza Riviera and the relocation of the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to various countries around the world. This vision forced the Arab state to advance an alternative plan to the transfer idea. Meanwhile, we have heard in the weekend about direct negotiation between Trump administration and Hamas, talking about release of American hostages and Hudna, which is a long-term ceasefire. So what's next? On the face of it, Israel stands at a crossroad which has several options at its disposal. Resuming the war in Gaza, which will further weaken Hamas, but might also endanger the life of the Israeli hostages. In fact, the IDF is preparing these direction led by the new chief of staff, Eyal Zamir. Other option, adopting Trump's vision. Is it feasible? I'm not sure, but it's on the table. The other option is moving to the second phase of the negotiation, allowing for the continuing of the ceasefire and release of hostages in exchange for the Palestinian prisoner. Which path will Israel choose? What are Hamas margins of flexibility? How do Israel and the Palestinian publics perceive these developments? And what is the role of the USA and the Arab state in the next phase? In order to get some answer to those questions, we invited 4 experts joining us from Israel, Dr. Harel Chorev and Professor Tamar Hermann. Dr. Harel Chorev is a senior researcher at the Moshe Dayan Center in Tel Aviv University, an expert on the Palestinian society and politics. He has written widely on terrorism, social media, influence, and other issues. Professor Tamar Hermann, an Israeli political scientist specializing in tracking public opinion. She currently works at academic director at the Fitterby Family Center for Public Opinion and Policy Research at the Israeli Democratic Institution. From the Washington Institute, here with me, al-Omari. Race is the Gilbert Foundation Senior Fellow, former advisor to the Palestinian Authority, and expert in the Palestinian issue and other issues. David Schenker. David is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute and director of the Rubin Program on Arab Politics. Previously, he served as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs during the first Trump administration. Before we start, you, the audience, will have a chance to get into our discussion after the opening remark of our panelists. Please do that in one of two ways. If you're on Zoom, go to the Q&A function on the Zoom bar and fill in your question. If you are not on Zoom and joining us via another platform, please email us at policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Again, policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. I will do my best to include your question into our discussion. With that, I will turn to my colleague, Dr. Harel Chorev. Please, the floor is yours.
Mute.
You're on mute, Harel.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me, Naomi. Very happy to be here. I will just give a few comments, brief comments. I understand that I have 7 minutes, Naomi?
Yes, you do.
Regarding both Israel and the Hamas situation by the end of phase A, and maybe something regarding the future, the close future. First of all, I think it's important to clarify several major, I think, points. Some very often taken in some sort of a mistake, not only abroad, not only in the US, both in Israel. Many people say, in regard to the second phase, the military option is not really a good option or a feasible option, as we didn't defeat Hamas in the first 15 months that we had. So I'm not saying anything regarding the chances, obviously, but I want to make it clear why it was not possible from the first place. And it's not because of Hamas or Hamas any sort of tactique. Hamas is not above the nature. It's not a metaphysic force. It is a guerrilla force that Israel dealt actually quite well in terms of dealing with all the multi-dimensional warfare that Hamas forced Israel to tackle. The first thing is that Israel, I don't know how many people knows, but Israel didn't attack the whole Gaza Strip. The IDF attacked something like 70% out of the Gaza Strip. Two major areas were not generally attacked. One is Gaza City, which we can say that something like 50% out of this central area for both Hamas command and control over the Gaza Strip were not attacked. And the second area is the central camps, namely Dir el-Balach area, Nuseirat, refugee camps, and the rest of the camps concentrated in the center of the Gaza Strip. In total, something like 30% out of the Gaza Strip. Why didn't the IDF attack? Hostages. That was the only reason why the IDF didn't attack. Hamas tactic was to move the hostages rapidly from house to house, from tunnel to tunnel. And although we had the general idea where they are, once they were moved in the same area, the IDF just decided not to attack the whole area. So obviously it's impossible to defeat an organization if you don't attack something like 30% out of its territory. The second thing is, of course, the fact that Israel, at least not until the operation in the northern Gaza Strip, namely in the Jabalia refugee camp, Bet Hanun and Bet Lahia area, the IDF didn't stay in territories that it occupied. Instead, the IDF raided those areas again and again and again. And the raid method had its own logic. Today, it's very popular to attack it, at least in Israel, to say it had no reason, but it sure had. First of all, the IDF was short in soldiers, while we are deployed in several fronts all over the country, the West Bank, Syria, and obviously Lebanon for a very long time. That was a major obstacle for employing a full occupation of a territory. And that was something that obviously didn't allow any long-term achievement, not to mention the fact that Israel didn't present a day after plan or a vision, as so many people told it from I think it was maybe 3 weeks after the war started that Naomi and I started to discuss this question of why don't we hear a day after plan, a post-war plan for the war. I think now this discourse is more, I would say, visible, but still it's somewhere under a question mark. Now, let me move to Hamas situation during the war. Hamas had suffered, obviously, a very, very hard blow to its abilities, much more, I must say, than I heard very often in places like CNN, and even as the version of the American intelligence service. I think it was not even close to what those analysis presented. Something like 20,000 fighters of the organization, and obviously also a lot of infrastructure. Over 50% of the tunnels were destroyed, their main means of production of the weapons. And we need to understand 90% out of the weapon in the Gaza Strip was manufactured in the Gaza Strip. It was not a matter of smuggling it in from the outside. Materials, yes, vital materials and everything, yes. But most of the weapon was produced in the Gaza Strip, and Israel destroyed most of it. Now, by when we reached to the deal, what we saw was that it was not that Hamas was able to fill up its ranks every day with thousands of fighters that it was often presented. Yes, they did mobilize thousands, but we're talking about very often, at least, children's or youth, 15, 16, that were mobilized with a six-pack of water bottles or other kinds of aid that was offered to their families. $20, $30 salary for a month, stuff like that. Now, when you mobilize kids that basically are not committed ideologically, were not trained for years and years like the fighters that Hamas lost, just to give you an idea, the commanders of Hamas were in their position very often for 10 and sometimes even 20 years. Okay, as battalion commanders, as company commanders for many, many years. So anyone who thinks that they are, disposable in that way, that anyone can fill up their place, I think it's far-fetched. These youngsters are being trained at the moment with brochures, with other means, with guidance, but they are, I would say, expected to be a threat on Israel when and if Israel will decide to go in. What I can say about that I was at least impressed, and I think by that I will summarize my talk, is that I read that Hamas is already firing and suspending workers and members that were not efficient enough in the war. And when we talk about not efficient enough, I'm not talking necessarily about fighters and terrorists. I talk about people in the civil servant who were just gone, nowhere to be found. And Hamas is closing the account at the moment, but not just a revenge thing. I want to say it in a way that as an organization, it seems that they are conducting in a healthy way, getting rid of people who disappointed them. Just to close my talk, I would say that going to phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is a more tactical phase for Hamas. They saw it as an urgent phase to stop, obviously, the war and their destruction, and to give them a chance to rebuild the ranks of the organization with all those recruits, and obviously to fill up their storage with the aid and gasoline and the rest of it. The second phase is a strategic one, and this is the way I think we should see it, something which is aimed to make sure that Hamas will survive with its weapon, and at the end of the day, with its control over the Gaza Strip, even if they withdraw from the officially from the government. Thank you.
Thank you, Harel. From your talk, we can understand what is needed in order to achieve what the Israeli government talk about, the eradication of Hamas. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to turn to Tamar Hermann. Tamar, the floor is yours.
Mute.
You're on mute.
Some would say that it's wonderful that I'm on mute, but I'll talk anyway. Thank you, Naomi, for inviting me. Thank you for discussing this very critical issue, the transition from phase A to phase B, because on Israeli public opinion level, this issue is not being discussed. The issue of the first phase and the transition to the second phase is actually political in domestic terms. Some in the government are strongly against moving to the second phase, whereas outside of the opposition of the coalition on the opposition side, many are advocating the progress in this direction. However, on the public opinion level, the issue of the second phase is not clear at all, because we really don't know. I mean, following the media, has it already started? Because there were some indications that the phase B discussions are already on. On the other hand, the government is saying that we are not going to move to the second phase. So people are very confused. I have 7 minutes and 7 slides. And I'll start by showing you how do Israelis perceive the advantages or disadvantages that each side has from phase A. I'd like to see my presentation. Okay, that's a snapshot. First slide. It's on your side. First slide, not the front slide. Okay. We asked in January 25, meaning a month and a half ago, whose interests were better served by the first stage of the agreement between Israel and Hamas. Of course, if Israelis think that Hamas will serve better, they will not be so keen on moving to the second phase, okay? As you can see, amongst the Israeli Arabs, there is a slight majority saying both sides' interests were served to the same amount. What I did was presenting the three main political camps in Israel, but you should keep in mind that the left is about 13 to 14, 13 or 15% of the Jewish population. Center is about 23 to 25%, and the rest, almost 60%, define themselves as being on the right. So as you can see, on the left, there is about the same number who think that Hamas got it better, and 35% say both sides were served to the same degree. At the center already, we see a plurality, not a majority, but still the plurality of the people who put themselves in the center say Hamas was served better. And on the right, we see a majority saying that Hamas was served better. This means that if you take all three together, taking into consideration also the proportions, then we are around 48 to 50% saying Hamas was served better. And this is a very bad indication for those who are trying to convince the Israeli public that we should move to the second phase, which, as Harel mentioned earlier, is strategic, not tactical one, okay? It calls for much more far-reaching decisions on behalf of Israel in order to move to the second phase and get something out of it at the end of the day. Now, my second slide, I hope that you'll see. We asked who contributed in this tactic phase, the first phase, and I'm sure that in the US you will be very glad to see that President Trump is perceived by most Israelis as the figure that contributed the most to the release of the hostages, which is the issue that stands at the center of the public discourse in Israel. The hostages are perceived as more important than everything, and the politicians on the right who are saying, no, the hostages are important, but there are some issues that are even more important than that, Israel's security in the future and the future of Hamas. So as you can see, we have over 80% saying US President Trump actually did the job. And if this is the most important job in the eyes of most Israelis, then the direction is clear. However, if you look at Prime Minister Netanyahu, you can see that less than 50%, actually 40-something% only say he should be the one to be thanked for releasing the hostages. The negotiating team is higher. The IDF pressure on Gaza is to be thanked for what happened. All the demonstrations and the pressures from the hostages. And this is very important because when we segment the answers by the political camps, we see that Trump is on top on the three camps scale of thanksgiving, but second comes on the left, the demonstrations and the pressures from the hostages families, whereas on the right, they think that these had only minimal effect on the release of the hostages. So the public is not unified in explaining to ourselves who is responsible in the best case and in the worst case, okay? My next slide will show you the day after, because it has to do with phase B. Who would you like to see in Gaza on the day after? And as you can see, Jews, also January 25, the plurality are for a multinational force, whereas the Arabs, the plurality, 29%, opted for the weakened Hamas option. this is something that signals that something is going on amongst the Israeli Arabs, who at the beginning of the war were expressing very strong criticism about Hamas. Okay, so something is happening here. We still don't know whether it is deeper than what we see here, but certainly there is no agreement between the Jews and Arabs about the day after. Okay, then I'd like to show you the support. Next slide, please. We asked about moving into the second phase, the phase two. Agreed that in the light of the recent events, Israel should continue with the second phase to include a complete cessation of hostilities, withdrawal from Gaza, and the release of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the release of all hostages. Here you can see that the Arabs are almost of one opinion that we should move ahead with that. But also amongst the Jews, we see very high percentage of those who are saying, yes, we should move to the second phase. And what's very interesting is that there was an increase between our first measurement that was in January and then in February. Okay, so in 1 month, we saw an increase in the support for moving to the second phase. Of course, on the left is higher, the Jewish left is higher than the Arabs in its support for the progress into the second phase. But also on the right, we see a majority saying yes. And this has to do with the differences between the right as represented in the coalition and the right on the grassroots level. Next slide, please. We asked about what should they do now. Prime Minister Netanyahu, should he resign? Should he not resign? Should he take responsibility, not take responsibility? 48% answered our question that he should accept responsibility and resign immediately. If you add to them the respondents who said, yes, he should accept responsibility, but resign only at the end of the war, of course, together it comes to a significant majority. But what does it mean, the end of the war? I mean, if he reads correctly the data, he will say, we'll continue with the war forever. So I will not have a majority demanding my resignation and accepting responsibility. Heads of security agencies, this was asked immediately after Chief of Staff Halevi resigned. And we see 58% saying that they should, at that time, resign, regardless of whether the heads of the political leadership resign or not. We have a majority here saying the heads of the security agencies, meaning IDF, Mossad, and Shabak, they should go home anyway. In order to get 58%, we need to have the people of the left, center, and right. So the support for the immediate resignation of the heads of the security agencies is higher than the support for the immediate resignation of Netanyahu. Now I'll show you 2 slides, and this will be my last slides about the Trump plan, and then how to which extent we can rely on Trump's support in Israel. So there is almost a consensus, which is very rare in Israel, that the Trump's plan has started a more relevant discussion of possible options for ending the war. And the similarity between the left, center, and right is amazing, because we hardly get such a consensus between the 3 political blocs or orientations. So amongst the Jews, we have 3/4 saying, yes, it opened a refreshed discussion that regardless of its practicality, the Trump plan did something, it stirred the pot. Okay, amongst the Arabs, of course, they are not happy with that. But this only shows you that when you see the total sample, it means nothing because it has the Arabs who are about 17% of the Israeli population and the Jews who are 73%, depending on how do you count. But basically, a total sample means nothing besides an average. Therefore, be careful when you read in your newspaper that the total sample in Israel is such and such. My last slide, we asked what's the likelihood that President Trump will turn away from Israel if he thinks that its policies are not aligned with the interests of the United States, of course, following the Ukraine example. And here you see that the majority of the Jews and the Arabs think that the chances are very low, even higher amount amongst the Arabs think that Trump is not going to turn its back on Israel. When we segmented it by political camps, you see that the left is more skeptical of Trump and the right is more confident that President Trump will stay with us and that the Ukraine is not a proper comparison to the Israeli case. So this is it. And if you have further questions, I'll be glad to answer.
Thank you very much, Professor Tamar Hermann. So according to these polls regarding the Israeli public, you can see that in general, you can say that the Israeli public is willing to move to the next phase of the ceasefire, which is very important issue. Before I move to our other panelist here, I want to remind you again, the audience at home, if you want to get into our discussion and submit a question to our panelist, please email us at policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org or use the Q&A function of the Zoom bar. Okay, Race, we would like to hear about the other side of the Palestinian arena, the West Bank, and other issues that connected to this issue. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Naomi. And it's a pleasure being with such colleagues. Look, I'm going to answer your question from two angles. One angle is going to be the reality on the ground in the West Bank. And the other angle is what is the Palestinian Authority doing in order to prepare itself for phase two. So look, I mean, on the reality on the ground, first of all, obviously, we know the West Bank has been fragile and volatile for a very long time, even before October 7th. What was remarkable is the fact that throughout the war, actually, the West Bank remained quiet. It's a very complicated analysis of why it remained quiet. Yet what we're seeing since the ceasefire is an erosion of some of the anchors that kept the West Bank quiet. And I am frankly more worried right now about the volatility of the West Bank and the possibility of a security breakdown. And here I would focus on really a number of factors. One of it is the fact that during the war, one of the reasons why people in the West Bank did not rise up into a third intifada, despite provocations from Hamas, despite provocation from Israeli settlers, despite Iran pumping money and weapons into it, is the fact that for many in the West Bank, they did not want to experience what happened in Gaza. It had a deterrent effect, no doubt about it. The problem is today, we see that some of the tactics used in Gaza are being now used in the West Bank. If you look at the refugee camps in the northern West Bank, Jenin, Tulkarm, etc., we see displacement of people, we see home demolitions, we see a use of military hardware that, as you mentioned in the beginning, was not used since the second intifada. So the sense that the people have nothing to lose is actually disappearing. That's one. And two, I think people also had a hope that once the war is over, things will go back to normal if they remain quiet. Here again, you hear some of the statements from people like the Israeli defense minister, etc. And this is sending a message to the Palestinians in the West Bank that things will not get better. So the public mood is getting more and more sour, which has not yet turned into a second intifada. Yet we see more planned and implemented terror attacks coming not only from Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but from local sources. So I would keep an eye on this particular dynamic. Where is the public? And my sense is on that one, the public is losing hope, and as such, the possibility of breakdown is becoming more real. The other factor that I think is impacting public mood in the West Bank is, I think, a very strong sense that Hamas has won the war. The way the ceasefire has been structured has allowed Hamas to basically say, look, we are also winning. They have emphasized this message. By the way, this is a message they were been sending even during the war. But after the war, they emphasized this message through the optics of the hostage releases and showing that Hamas is in control, through showing that they are in control in the Gaza in general, controlling, law and order, governance, etc. I think the last week had also helped Hamas tremendously in pushing this narrative when it became known that the US and Hamas have been engaged in direct negotiations. Hamas has always been vulnerable to the Palestinian public because it was always portrayed as an isolated movement, that a movement that cannot conduct Palestinian diplomacy, cannot talk to the world, it's isolated. With the US talking directly to Hamas, this gave Hamas a degree of legitimacy, and it's allowed it to say to the public, look, choose us and the world will still talk to us. We see this message being sent by Hamas, social media, traditional media. You see it open Al Jazeera every day, and this is a key message that they are pushing. So today, I think Hamas is in a stronger position in the West Bank, and I am actually more worried as we move forward, particularly if Hamas can contain and can continue the narrative of victory as we move to phase 2. Now, the PA is watching all of this. And just as Harel said earlier that Hamas sees phase 2 as a strategic phase, so does the Palestinian Authority. And to deal with this, they are trying to present themselves as a partner for moving to phase 2 and beyond phase 2. They want to show that they are a partner ultimately with the hope of going and taking over Gaza. They've been doing many things, but I would focus on 3 main points that they're trying to do. And many of these are vis-a-vis the United States. The first step that the PA took was dealing with the issue of, or bringing itself into compliance with the Taylor Force Act in the United States. The Taylor Force Act deals with what we call the pay for slay. The US doesn't pay the Palestinian Authority unless they stop payments to the families of what's called the so-called martyrs and of prisoners. The PA took a decision to change this policy. How real this decision is, we don't know. We will know once it starts being implemented. On this one, I think the US will have to continue looking very closely. If you look at the legislation, Taylor Force and other laws, they have a verification mechanism. So we will know in time. What we do know that so far, this is creating some pushback among the Fatah leadership. Some had to be fired because by Abbas, the Palestinian president, because they opposed it. But we have not yet seen a public reaction because the public has not yet seen the actual implications and implementation of this change. So for this one, I would wait and see. I wouldn't celebrate it, but I wouldn't say that this is meaningless at this point. The second thing that I think, and more importantly, maybe on the ground, the PA has started to show that it's willing to act on a security front, from a security point of view. We saw security operations by the Palestinian security forces, initially in Tubas in the northern West Bank, and then in Jenin. This also has mixed results. On the one hand, and I think on the positive side, it showed that the PA right now understands that it has to act. It has to act in the West Bank to maintain a degree of stability, but also it understands that it has to show that it can be a security partner in post-conflict Gaza. This is the good news. The bad news is that the results are not very encouraging. Yes, reports are that the Palestinian security forces actually did a professional job, good interagency coordination, etc. But the proof is in the pudding, and so far the Palestinian Authority has not shown that it has the capability, even if it had the will, to do this. And from a Washington perspective, I think what this argues for is for the US to continue working with the Palestinian security forces. We have a mission there, the US security coordinator. This is a mission that has played an important role, both in building the capabilities of the PA and in encouraging PA Israeli security coordination. And that's something that we should invest more in if we see that the PA is actually willing to take security action. And finally, I will mention the point of Palestinian reform. Palestinian reform has been an issue that's been on the table for a very long time. And what was interesting, PA President Mahmoud Abbas actually started sending certain signals of willingness to do reform in the Palestinian Authority. Most interesting about this, in my mind at least, is where Abbas made this announcements. Abbas made these announcements in the recent Arab League summit in Egypt, I think on March 4th. He talked about creating a successor or a deputy at least, and of bringing back some of the people who were expelled from the Fatah movement. To me, the venue was very important because it's very clear that Abbas is doing this not in response to pressure from the United States. This administration has not yet made this an issue on its agenda, but rather as a response to pressure from Arab countries. Arab countries are tired of the PA being in the way it is. They're tired of Abbas. Again, notable that he was not invited to the Arab consultative meeting in Saudi Arabia. So they are feeling the heat, and they are trying to, and Abbas is trying to present himself as responsive to this heat. I am personally skeptical. I've seen Abbas play these games before. However, from an American perspective, what it shows that today we have an interest and a willingness from Arab countries to push the Palestinian Authority towards reform. I don't see this administration here in Washington having the bandwidth to engage in the nitty-gritty of reform, but this is something that we should lean on Arab allies to continue their pressure and to continue their policy in this direction. There is a lot of uncertainty towards phase two, but ultimately I think if phase two ends up with a situation where Hamas can claim that, okay, we survived, we won, and we remained the power on the ground, then this can have very negative implications for stability in the West Bank. If, however, Hamas can be shown to be defeated and we have a pathway to the Palestinian Authority coming back to Gaza, this, I believe, will strengthen the PA and will make it easier to push the PA to do some of the constructive work that we need them to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghaith. It seems that the West Bank continued to challenge Israel, and in the short term and the long term. And if Israel think about resume the war, it needs to take under consideration also the other part of the Palestinian arena, which is the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian public, which is very important. With your permission, we will move to David Schenker. David Schenker, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be with you. So it's no secret that the Gaza Riviera plan was rejected outright by all of the Arab states, and indeed much of the world. The notion of even temporary Palestinian displacement from Gaza was deemed unacceptable. And we subsequently had National Security Advisor Waltz and Secretary of State Rubio highlight how this actually would present an opportunity for Arab states to propose their own alternative plans. And so we had King Abdullah come to Washington in February, meeting with President Trump. That could have been really quite a difficult meeting. In the end, King Abdullah mentioned that he would come back to the president with an alternative plan. There was a subsequent meeting in Riyadh on the 20th with Riyadh, Egypt, Jordan, UAE, and Qatar in attendance. And then subsequently on March 4th, this emergency Arab League summit in Cairo, where they rolled out the Egyptian plan called Early Recovery, Reconstruction, and Development of Gaza. And as we move forward to phase two, I think this is for many Arab states. This is the only game in town. And so this Egyptian plan has two sections. One is the report and the general context. That's about 16 pages. The other is the technical report, which is about 85 pages. All told, 106 pages. The meat of the plan is focused on reconstruction, which lays out $53 billion in the rebuilding of Gaza with Palestinians present in the Strip. It's filled with schematics of Gaza. It's replete with artificial intelligence generated pictures of smiling Palestinians and sleek buildings and quote unquote smart, eco-friendly, and sustainable and humane development goals. It's fine. The first section, though, the 16 pages is quite problematic. There's a grand total of 2 sentences on the topics of governance and security. On governance, the proposal suggests the establishment of an administrative committee comprised of technocrats to run Gaza for 6 months. This committee, we know, based on previous reporting from Egyptian dialogues aimed at brokering a Hamas-Fatah reconciliation, will be chosen, this committee, by both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. On security, Egypt and Jordan will train Palestinian Authority police like they did in the heyday of Oslo, and to pay for this, the report says there's going to be a fundraising conference, also for the $53 billion. It doesn't identify any particular country that's going to take the lead on this. The proposal also suggests UN peacekeeping forces to deploy in Gaza, also, interestingly, to the West Bank. And of course, renewed peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. As for Hamas, one wouldn't know that the organization existed, like Voldemort, the terrorist organization that shall not be mentioned. The proposal does not say once the word Hamas. What to do about so-called armed factions? The proposal says, in a profound understatement, the issue remains challenging. The Egyptian plan says that the issue will be resolved when the root causes are addressed and after Palestinian statehood. So there's nothing in there about Hamas disarmament. So overall, this is pretty, I think, thin gruel, which is why I believe that both Mohammed bin Salman and Mohammed bin Zayed likely opted not to attend this emergency Arab summit. The Egyptian proposal at the end of the day is a consensus document that has to include the inputs of Qatar. It has to include the interests of other spoiler states like Algeria. And it appears that the proposal was not sufficiently bold in terms of Hamas and governance to gain the robust support of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. The Trump administration critique of the proposal largely focuses on construction that it underestimates the timeline and the fact that the Palestinians will remain in Gaza throughout the process. Israel apparently is still inclined toward the Gaza Riviera plan. But Steve Witkoff, I think, was relatively encouraging in his own way, indicating that this was somewhat of a useful starting point for discussions. Now, we may be headed toward another ceasefire in Gaza, reports say today, an extension of some sort through the end of Ramadan and Passover, or we may see the resumption of Israeli military operations against Hamas in Gaza. From where I sit, for the administration, for the interest of both Palestinians and the surrounding states and Israel as well, an improved, bolder Arab plan that might include some Arab military deployments in Gaza in support of the Palestinian Authority, and an approach to Gaza that actually excludes Hamas could preempt very well a resumption of Israeli military operations. So I think going forward, it's incumbent on Washington to engage Saudi and the United Arab Emirates to see if they can work together to convince the 22-member Arab League to think bigger in Gaza. And just one final word on the engagement with Hamas, the unprecedented U.S. Direct negotiations with Hamas, and the statements from Adam Bowler, the hostage negotiator. I'm not in support of this type of engagement. I don't think it's particularly productive, but what we know, or what we've heard from these engagements, is that Hamas is offering what is also always offered, essentially, which is a resumption of Hudna, or temporary couple-year ceasefire. I think if the administration embraces that, Gaza will not only not be rebuilt, there may be some sort of rift between Washington and Israel. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. This is interesting to see how the external players look at this conflict and how they try to give kind of solution to this situation. So after we have 4 interesting presentation, and we have also many questions, I want to ask you, Tamar, this is the question of one of the audience, what the impact on the public opinion in Israel by the separate direct negotiation being conducted by the Trump administration with Hamas?
Well, I don't have fresh data on that, but of course, from the Israeli point of view, it is something that is being done above the head of Israel as the prime, I would say, player in this game. I mean, the fact that Washington is discussing issues directly with Hamas, and as Raif mentioned correctly, it gives legitimacy to Hamas. So from the point of view of certainly the government, but also the opposition doesn't see it as something that is positively instrumental for Israel. It's a kind of a sign that Israel is an obstacle, as was already mentioned, within Israel and outside Israel. And second, it's like being a protege of a superpower, which is negotiating on as if its behalf, but certainly with its own interests.
Thank you very much. Another question asking about the Israeli leadership and society. Does Israel can accept long-term UDNA in this time?
It might, but the key issue is the return of the hostages. I would guess that Israeli public opinion will change dramatically once this issue is resolved this way or another. This is something that most Israelis of all political walks cannot accept as an issue that will stay in some kind of a limbo. I mean, as long as Israeli public opinion will not stabilize until this issue is resolved, and then we might have some kind of an opening for Israelis to think differently about the entire issue. Now, the question is, who is on the other side of the Hudna? If it is, again, Hamas, and this will give Hamas more legitimacy as a partner, then, of course, certain political segments in Israel will refuse to such a way out of the war. Others will be more, I would say, practical, as they will see Hamas as the only option to come to any kind of an agreement in Gaza.
Thank you. Harel? You're on mute. Harel, you're on mute. Harel?
Yes, I can hear. Regarding which of the question would you like me to answer? Regarding the Hudna?
Ask about
regarding the Hudna?
Yes.
Well, if Hudna, which we need to understand, Hudna in the Hamasi or Islamist interpretation, it's not really a ceasefire. It's something which we may translate into the warriors break or something like that, which means until he will get stronger, okay, against a mighty enemy. The last time that Hamas offered a hudnah was in 2007, 2008 to Olmert, and I think it was Khaled Mash'al. At that time, the hudnah included conditions that, as far as I can assess, no Israeli would accept in exchange to the hudnah, such as the return of the refugees, 67 lines, including Jerusalem and the Wailing Wall, and other conditions that are that I don't see even the most leftist Israelis accepting, just in exchange of Hamas promising to avoid from continue fighting in the next 10 or 20 years. Back then they were talking about 20 years. So, and in any case, a hudnah can be certainly, in my view, titled as a victory for Hamas. And in that time, I think it matters more than any time before that Israel will not allow such titling of the catastrophe both Israelis and Palestinians underwent in the past year and a half. That's what I can say about the hudnah. Not to mention that the other side of weakening the Palestinian Authority, which is bad, very bad, and all the moderate forces within the Palestinian society.
Okay, regarding this, Raith, there's question about the day after Hamas. Who can do this? Who can replace Hamas in Gaza Strip? And is it this can be implemented?
All right, thank you, Naomi. I mean, first of all, important to note, and I will again emphasize what Harel said in his opening remarks, the first section. Hamas is weaker. Militarily defeating Hamas is possible. In the same way that militarily defeating any terror organization, any insurgency is possible. Much has been done and much can still be done. The question, though, is what do you do once you have a military victory? Military without a political vision ultimately accrues to Hamas's interest. And here we have three scenarios, I believe. One scenario is, frankly, Israel coming in and occupying Gaza long term. Possible, but I think negative. It's up to the Israelis to decide whether or not this is good for them. But I can tell you that certainly this will allow Hamas, not maybe in Gaza, but in the West Bank and elsewhere, to present itself again as a resistance movement. This will strengthen the resistance narrative, and it will make it difficult for the moderate voices in the Arab world to actually go on the offensive. So that's kind of one option. Another option, which is what we're seeing right now: have no plan, have no policy, leave a vacuum. Eventually, Hamas will fill this vacuum. There is no other organization, no other power right now in Gaza that is organized, armed, etc., to take over Gaza. Yes, Hamas today is much weaker, but to control Gaza, you don't need rockets and you don't need heavy weaponry. A few AK-47s and a few committed members can do that. So that's the second scenario. The third scenario, which is the most positive one, is to create a governing alternative. Here, I think the Arab countries, and here I fully agree with David, there are splits in the Arab world, but some countries like the United Arab Emirates, like the Saudis, are actually willing to play an important role. This can be the alternative, to have those countries play this role. However, these countries also have certain conditions. They have certain expectations from the Israelis in terms of both political and declarative expectations, but also, most importantly, in terms of how do you do deconfliction on the ground from a security point of view. I don't see a fourth option. These are the options that we have right now. One will leave Hamas in power. One would get Israel, in my view, into a quagmire that is very hard to see how they're going to go out of. And the third is a more complicated scenario of having the Arabs come in, but for that, everyone has to do a degree of heavy lifting.
Thank you very much. David, what are you gambling? You're gambling regarding the next phase. Are we going to pass to the next phase, or Israel going to resume the war?
There's too many variables here. Whether they can come in with a better proposal, the Arab states, in terms of what role they can play alongside of the PA, about whether Israel can in fact ever accept the PA going into Gaza. And then there are, and I'm not sure if we have the right panel for this, but all the considerations of the government of Israel, whether if you move actually to the second phase, whether the government of Israel stays intact, right? Whether Netanyahu keeps his coalition, what type of considerations have to be made on that front. So a lot of moving parts here, but ultimately, the idea of the third option, as Ghaith said, something that may prevent a resumption of fighting, which will, I think, depending on what Israel's strategy is, and I think we've got some hints about what the tactics will be if they actually resume, suggests to me that this is a very long-term project, right? This is not a 3-month or 2-month operation. This is going to be long-term. And so I'm not sure that's a decision that Israel wants to make. If you look at all the strategic considerations, 180,000 men and women under arms, issues on the northern border, shaky relations or sensitive time for for Israel-Egypt relations, potential for deterioration in the West Bank, and a large-scale military operation that may take significant forces in Gaza. How many days of reserve duty are we going to get up to for the average Israeli, and what does that mean for the society? I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. We try to answer the question. I guess we have more questions than an answer, because so many factors influence this situation. And actually, Israel is in a crossroad and in a point that they need to decide long-term achievement, a short-term achievement. Let's hope that Israel managed to achieve the release of the hostage. It was very important, and the long-term achievement. Professor Tamar Hermann, Dr. Harel Chorev, David Schenker, and al-Omari, thank you for participating in this panel. Thank you all, the audience at home, for your joining us. Hope to see you in a future event of the Washington Institute. Thank you very much.